What if I told you that one of the greatest generals in human history once found himself trapped between a roaring sea and the largest army the world had ever seen, outnumbered 5-1, and yet he didn't just survive, he won? And what if the victory wasn't by brute strength or luck, but by a plan so cunning it shattered an empire and changed the course of civilization forever? This is the story of the Battle of Issa, battle where Alexander the Great, barely in his 20s, faced King Darius III of Persia, the ruler of a realm that stretched from Egypt to India. It's a story of ambition, strategy, and psychology of two men who represented two worlds colliding. One, a young Macedonian lion hungry for glory. The other, a Persian monarch fighting to preserve a 1,000-year-old legacy by the end of this story. You'll understand why this battle wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a test of intellect, courage, and destiny itself. So stay with me, because the twists in this tale will make you question, how far can genius go when trapped by impossible odds? Don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next will leave you breathless. The empire at the edge of chaos. What if the road to immortality began with a single step onto a creaking wooden dock? And what if the next step, taken by a 20-year-old king, forced the largest empire on earth to wake up and bare its teeth? The shore of Asia smelled of pine and salt the morning Alexander leaped from his ship and pressed his palm into foreign soil. He didn't whisper a prayer. He didn't have to. The hush around him felt like the world had leaned in to listen. Behind him, the Macedonian phalanx stacked their sarissas like a forest, bronze heads winking under a sun that hadn't decided whether to bless or burn. Ahead lay a continent of cities, kings, and quarrels, the drifting smoke of 1,000 hearths that all answered to one name: Persia. He had crossed the narrow blue throat of the Hellespont with a promise heavier than his armor. His father, Philip, had sharpened Macedon into a spear and taught it to fly. His assassination left the weapon in mid-air, and Alexander took it in his hand before it fell. Even now, you can almost hear the drum of Philip's reforms inside the columns, the drill, the relentless discipline, the stubborn refusal to break formation. But a spear needs not just strength, needs aim. And Alexander aimed for the heart. Have you ever wondered what courage sounds like when it's not shouting? It sounds like a young general saying, calmly, that he will attack across a river whose far bank glitters with enemy cavalry. It sounds like him rolling up his sleeve and showing his men a body stitched with scars, as if to say pain is a familiar, friendly thing. At the Granicus in the spring light, Persian nobles charged with a confidence born of centuries. But confidence is not the same as preparation. Alexander cut into the river like a knife, his companion cavalry punching above the current, the phalanx bridging behind. For a heartbeat, the splashing drowned the world. Then the splashing turned to screams. The first shock of victory rippled down the coast. Cities that had once sent taxes east now sent garlands and keys. Sardis opened. Ephesus trembled. Miletus tried to fight and learned what fighting looked like against men who refused to stop marching. In the smoking ruin of Halicarnasses, Alexander stood where walls had been and tasted the grit of future plans. "Show me your coasts," he seemed to say, "and I will show you a chain." One port, then the next, and the next, cutting Persian fleets from their harbors until the very sea forgot their names. But victories breed a different kind of enemy. Time. Time enough for the great king to turn and look north. In the high halls of Persepolis and Susa, where walls wore the painted weight of empires and courtiers walked like careful cats, Darius III began to understand the rumor wasn't just rumor. A Macedonian, not yet old enough to be tired, was stitching Asia Minor into a Macedonian cloak. Envoys fluttered. Scribes scratched. Lists were made. The number of horsemen, the number of chariots, the number of men it would take to teach a boy the meaning of scale. There's a story the soldiers told, the one about the knot at Gordium. They say the rope was a snarl of oak bark lashed to a wagon, and that whoever loosened it would hold Asia. They say Alexander looked at it for a quiet moment, the way he looked at problems like a map with a mistake in it. Then he either found an end with thoughtful fingers, or lifted his sword and laid the knot open with one clean stroke. Did it truly happen that way? History smiles and refuses to answer. What matters is that his men believed it. Belief is the currency of campaigns, and that day they spent it gladly. From Phrygia he moved east, collecting oaths and provisions, measuring distances not in miles but in days of grain and water skins filled. He loved the edge of the world the way a climber loves a cliff, every ledge a new view, every risk a new perspective. He slept little and rode hard, sometimes outpacing his own legend, sometimes arriving just as stories of him had convinced gates to swing inward. The army grew leaner, harder. The companions rode with the confidence of men who had followed their leader into rivers and out the other side. Parmenion, older and flint-eyed, counseled patience. Alexander listened, and then, often enough, did exactly as he'd meant to from the start. And then came Cilicia, and with it the river that nearly ended everything. The Kidnus runs cold, mountain-born, even when the land around it glows with summer. Alexander, heat-sick and dirty, stripped down and slid into the water with the sigh of a man who thinks he's earned a small indulgence. The cold seized his limbs like a god angry at being disturbed. He staggered out, shivered, and within hours the shivering turned to fever. This is the part of the story people forget. The greatest general of his age lay gasping in a darkened room while the world held its breath. Outside officers paced and murmured. The physician, Philip of Acarnania, prepared a draft. A letter arrived warning that the doctor was bribed to poison him. Inside, Alexander took the cup and drank it while handing Philip the warning. Imagine the room just then, the hush of shocked loyalty, the raw nerve of trust exposed. He slept. When he woke, the fever had loosened its grip. He rose. The army celebrated as if he had defeated death on the field, and perhaps in a way he had, because sometimes the enemy wears no armor and rides no horse. Sometimes it sits like lead in your bones. By now Darius had gathered his storm. The plain of Sochi, further south in Syria, filled with dust that did not settle. Persian cavalry in embroidered trousers and scale armor, chariots with blades singing to themselves, levies from satrapies whose names sounded like poems, immortals with their quivers like black wings. The great king would not stand back and delegate this humiliation. He would lead, and he would crush, and then the world would return to the rhythm it knew, the rhythm of tribute flowing east, and governors bowing low. Here is the turning point you didn't see coming. Darius did not wait on the plain he had chosen. He moved. He threaded his massive host through the Ammanic passes and northward, silently as a giant can be silent, until he was no longer ahead of Alexander, but behind him. The hunter found himself hunted. When the first reports reached the Macedonian camp at Myrandrus, it felt like a rumor inflated by fear. Then more scouts came, and more, faces grey with rain and worry. The great king was not where he should be. He was where Alexander had just been. Issus had fallen briefly into Persian hands, and those Macedonians, too wounded to move, left there to heal, met a savagery that travelled like a whispered curse. Men who had seen Granicus and lived had their throats cut on the pebble beaches. The river Panaurus watched and said nothing. Have you noticed how quickly a map can turn from confidence into crisis? Parmenion urged caution, a retreat south to better ground and safer supply. Alexander felt the tug of that good advice, and then he did what he always did when faced with a fork in the road. He created a third path. He gathered his commanders in the flicker of lamplight, their faces half gold, half shadow. He spoke quietly, not like a king issuing orders, but like a captain confessing an appetite. The enemy had stepped into the mountains, into narrow ground where sheer numbers could tangle and trip. If they turned north at once, if they moved with the urgency of men who believe the moment is a door that will swing shut, they could slam into Darius before the great king finished unrolling his carpet of war. Rain tapped the tent like fingertips. The men outside listened through the canvas as if sound could turn into strength. They had been living on rumors, and now rumor had become a direction. Alexander lifted a cup of watered wine, not to toast victory that would be vulgar, but to mark decision. The companions nodded, grins quick and sharp. The phalanx, the long spine of the army, began to move even before the order travelled down its length. In the distance, lightning drew white scars on the mountains, brief and vivid. There was a moment, riding north through the night, when even Alexander must have wondered whether he had chosen bravado over prudence. The path twisted under hooves. The torches threw greedy light that tried to eat the darkness and failed. He thought of his mother's stories, the ones where heroes met their fates, not by accident, but by appointment. He thought, too, of Darius, a man he had not yet seen, whose choices would decide whether their meeting felt like destiny or error. The cold bit. The rain diluted sweat into chill. He rode harder. Just before dawn, they reached the hills that looked down toward Issus. The sea crouched black and patient to the west. The river Panaurus glinted, a thin blade under the pale sky. Smoke smudged the horizon where cook fires dwindled, and somewhere down there, beyond the line of trees and the broken shore, a king with the wealth of a continent had pitched his tent, had arranged his guards, had just perhaps made a mistake. Alexander drew up and listened. The army stilled, as if they, too, could hear something being decided in the silence. He turned to Parmenion, to Philotas, to the knot of men who would follow him into anything and expect to come out the other side. He pointed toward the valley and smiled the dangerous little smile that always made them straighten in the saddle. Do you feel it, that tightening in your chest when the future leans over your shoulder? The night surrendered to the first uncertain light. A scout galloped in eyes wild, breath fogging in the cold. He had seen the banners. He had counted the chariots. He had watched the Persians forming along the river, and then he said the thing that made the air itself thin. The great king was there, not miles away, not days ahead, but there, within mark. The dance of kings, what happens when the hunter and the hunted trade places in the same night. And what if, in that single mistake, an empire's fate hangs trembling between two men's decisions? The dawn that followed was not golden, it was iron-grey, wet, and restless. Alexander's army stood poised along the narrow coastal plain near the small river called the Pinaros. Behind them, the mountains reared, steep and unforgiving. Before them, the Persian host stretched like a living tide of bronze, silk, and iron. The great king's banners moved with the morning wind, and even from a distance you could see the shimmer of countless spears catching the weak light. The odds were absurd. Some said 100,000 Persians faced 30,000 Macedonians. Others whispered even more. But numbers have a strange way of shrinking in the shadow of confidence, and Alexander's confidence that morning was enough to make fear seem foolish. He rode the line slowly, his horse, Bucephalus, snorting clouds into the cold air. Soldiers watched their young king pass, drenched in mud and resolve. "You see them," he called, his voice cutting through the wind. "They think their number makes them mighty, but they stand where no number can help them. The sea on one side, the mountains on the other, where can they run? Where can they breathe?" He let the question hang, and in the answering silence, the army remembered why they followed him. He never spoke to inspire fear. He spoke to make them feel like gods walking among mortals. Across the river, Darius III watched from his golden chariot, 1,000 years of Persian kingship weighing invisibly on his shoulders. He had chosen this place by accident, drawn into the narrow valley where his vast army could not spread its wings. It was as if fate had whispered, "Come here and see what happens when size becomes a cage." Yet Darius still believed in the majesty of numbers. Behind him, the immortals, the elite guard of Persia, stood in perfect symmetry, their robes embroidered with suns and eagles. Chariots bristling with blades waited at the front, their horses restless, metal glinting like fire. The king's command rippled outward like a drumbeat through water. Men moved, arrows were nocked. The earth began to tremble under the weight of waiting. Alexander studied the field with the eyes of a predator tracing weaknesses in prey. The Phalanx was shallow but treacherous, its banks slick with mud. The Persians had placed their best troops, Greek mercenaries, hardened by years of war, at the center, guarding the king himself. Their shields gleamed like fish scales. Their discipline would be deadly. But the flanks, those long wings of Persian infantry, stretched thin against the sea and mountain walls, were brittle with pride and panic. That's where the cut would come. He turned to Parmenion, his old general, on the left wing, and spoke in that calm, deliberate tone that always seemed to precede chaos. "Hold them. Do not yield a foot. I will break their right." And before the words had even faded, Alexander spurred Bucephalus toward the right flank, his companion cavalry falling in behind him, their spears upright like a field of silver thorns. Then the first arrow flew. The Battle of Issus began not with a roar, but with the sudden hiss of death-slicing air. Persian archers unleashed waves of arrows that darkened the sky. Shields lifted, bronze rang like struck bells. Macedonian phalanxes advanced, long pikes bristling, each man a part of a single, grinding machine. The river splashed red as feet trampled through it. The sound was not battle, it was thunder with a heartbeat. On the left, Parmenion faced the brunt of the Persian cavalry's fury. Horses crashed into shield walls. The air filled with dust and screams. For a moment, it seemed the Macedonian line would fold. The old general, iron-grey and unyielding, shouted orders through the din, keeping his men locked tight. "Stand. The boy buys you minutes. Buy him the world," he roared. On the right, Alexander's charge ignited like lightning. He aimed straight for the weak Persian flank, not the center, where Darius waited in grandeur. The companions lowered their lances, and for a few breathless seconds, the world was only hooves, steel, and motion. The impact tore the Persian wing open as if an invisible hand had ripped fabric apart. Alexander didn't stop. He pivoted inward, a sudden, violent curve toward the center. He wasn't just attacking, he was folding the Persian line into itself. And there, amid the chaos, the twist of fate revealed itself. Darius, watching from his chariot, saw his right wing disintegrating, his center exposed, and the unstoppable tide of Macedonians cutting toward him. Panic, the silent traitor of kings, brushed his shoulder. He shouted commands steady, hold, regroup, but the commands drowned in the noise of collapse. Around him, the immortals fought like stone statues, their arrows flying in mechanical rhythm, but even they couldn't fill the widening wound in the army's heart. Alexander saw the golden chariot glimmering like a beacon and pointed his spear straight at it. For a heartbeat that lasted a millennium, two kings' eyes met across the river and smoke. One the heir of a dying empire, drowning in the luxury of his ancestors. The other a son of the mountains, his hunger sharper than his sword. Darius's horses reared, the chariot jolted backward, the royal guard wavered. And then it happened what no Persian chronicler ever forgave. Darius turned his chariot, fled through his own men, and in that moment, the great king became a man running from his own shadow. The effect was instant and catastrophic. Armies don't just fight, they believe. When belief shatters, so does everything else. Persian lines broke like glass. The Macedonians surged forward, cutting down fleeing soldiers, driving the chariots into panic. Arrows fell short. The battle became a chase, then a rout. The river ran crimson, clogged with armor and bodies. Alexander did not stop until the field fell silent. He looked around at the smoking plain, the wreck of tents and banners, the glittering spoils of a world overturned. He had captured the royal family, Darius's wife, his mother, his daughters, all left behind in the king's haste. But the king himself had escaped, a ghost with an empire still behind him. Alexander, even in triumph, felt no rest. Victory had given him the world's attention, but not its submission. Darius still lived, and so did Persia. That night, the Macedonian camp burned with firelight and disbelief. The men feasted and laughed, drunk on survival. But inside Alexander's tent, the air was still. He had ordered the royal women to be treated with honor, not as captives but as guests. When his officers questioned this, he said quietly, "A king must know when to show restraint. I fight to conquer, not to humiliate." The words carried, and they became part of the legend, proof that his ambition was made of something colder and grander than greed. Yet beneath the calm there was restlessness. He knew this was not the end. Issus was only the beginning of a deeper gamer chase across deserts and mountains where victory would demand more than courage. It would demand obsession. Somewhere, far beyond the firelight, Darius was regrouping, summoning the remnants of his shattered pride and preparing for a reckoning greater than Issus. As the wind moaned through the broken shields and the sea whispered against the shore, Alexander stepped outside his tent and stared east. His shadow stretched long across the sand, pointing toward Babylon, toward Persepolis, toward the heart of the world. He smiled a thin, dangerous smile that seemed to know what history did not yet suspect, because the boy who had outsmarted a king was no longer chasing glory. He was chasing destiny, and somewhere, deep in the dark, destiny was beginning to chase him back. The king who ran, have you ever wondered what it feels like to be worshipped one night and hunted the next? Or how a man who commanded 1,000,000 lives could lose his crown not in battle but in a heartbeat of fear? Darius's flight from Issus was not a retreat. It was an unraveling. His chariot, built for ceremony, not speed, rocked wildly as it thundered through the narrow passes of the Amarnus Mountains. The royal guards struggled to keep up, dropping shields and banners in the mud. Rain slicked the road into glass. Behind him, the echo of Macedonian horns rose and fell, a phantom chase in the night. The great king, who once thought himself the center of the world, was now just another man running through it. In the tent he abandoned lay everything that defined him: his bow, his cloak, his crown, even his family. The Persian Empire, stretching from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush, suddenly looked like a mirage of power, beautiful from afar, but impossible to touch. Darius's commanders caught up with him by dawn, their armor smeared with blood, their faces ashen. He didn't speak. What words could fix the sight of one's own banner captured by another? Meanwhile, Alexander stood amid the ruins of Darius's camp, not with glee, but with a measured stillness that unnerved even his closest men. The spoils were vast gold, jewels silks, but his eyes wandered elsewhere. He ordered the royal family to be brought before him. The queen mother, Sisagombes, regal even in captivity, mistook Hephaestion for Alexander and bowed to him. Alexander, instead of laughing, knelt and said softly, "You are not wrong, for he too is Alexander." That single act of grace spread through the camp like fire in dry grass. His men called him merciful. His enemies called him divine. And that was the beginning of something far more dangerous than But legends are heavy things to carry. They feed on men's faith, on the stories whispered by soldiers and slaves alike. Every victory turned Alexander into something less human in their eyes, something destined. And yet, when the fires died down and silence crept over the camp, he was still a man, one haunted by the image of a king who ran. He could not sleep. His maps, unfurled across the table, glowed under lamplight lines of coast, rivers, deserts. His finger traced the route eastward, toward Phoenicia, toward Egypt, toward Babylon. Darius had fled inland, and to chase him blindly was to walk into a trap. Instead, Alexander chose patience's most cunning weapon. "To cut the head," he murmured, "first you must sever the veins." He would take the coast, every port and ship, until Persia's navy had nowhere to anchor, nowhere to flee. He knew Darius would expect a direct pursuit. He would instead strangle his empire from the sea inward. And so began the long, methodical tightening of the noose. He marched south along the narrow ribbon of land between mountain and sea, city by city, crushing resistance, accepting surrender. Tyre, the jewel of the Phoenicians, stood proud and defiant on its island fortress, its walls mocking him from across the waves. Many urged him to move on. He did not. To leave Tyre unconquered, he said, is to let fear survive. For 7 relentless months, the siege of Tyre tested every ounce of his will. He built a causeway from the mainland to the island, a monstrous path of stone through the sea. The Tyrians burned it. He built it again. Arrows rained. Ships rammed. He built again. Day after day, the sea swallowed Macedonians and Persians alike, but Alexander refused to retreat. His men began to call the causeway the king's bridge to madness. But madness often looks a lot like vision before it works. Finally, the walls fell. The storming of Tyre was merciless. Streets ran red, temples echoed with screams, but the victory was total. When Alexander walked through the ruins, the sea wind lashing his face, he wasn't smiling. He was listening to the silence that comes when an empire loses another breath. The news of Tyre's fall reached Darius like a blade between the ribs. The great king's advisors urged negotiation. Envoys rode west with words wrapped in gold. Darius offered his daughter's hand, a ransom for his family, and half his empire in exchange for peace. It was everything most conquerors would have accepted. But Alexander, sitting in his tent surrounded by maps and candlelight, heard the offer and laughed not in arrogance, but in disbelief. "Half the world," he said. "Tell him that what is his is already mine. If he would be safe, let him come to me not as a king to a king, but as a man to his conqueror." The messenger trembled. No one in the known world had ever spoken to the great king that way. Yet the words were sent, carried on the wind like a challenge to heaven itself. And Darius, he did not yield. Pride is the last fortress of the fallen. He gathered the remnants of his armies, rallied new levies from the east, and began preparing for another confrontation, this time on his terms, on open ground. He swore that at Gaugamela, the sun would witness the restoration of Persia. While he planned, Alexander marched again, through Syria, through Egypt, across sands that swallowed whole armies. At the oracle of Siwa, he sought the words that had haunted conquerors for centuries. "Am I chosen?" The priests greeted him not as a mortal, but as the son of Zeus. When they called him son of the god, he did not deny it. Perhaps he even believed it. Perhaps he needed to, because the boy who had crossed the Hellespont for glory was gone. In his place stood a man who now looked at the horizon and saw eternity. When he left Egypt, crowned pharaoh, he had become not just Alexander of Macedon, but Alexander of the world. Yet, for all his divinity, one name still echoed like thunder behind him: Darius. By the time he turned his march back north, the Persian king had rebuilt his power. From Babylon to the plains of Nineveh, he gathered a new army vast beyond imagining. Tens of thousands of cavalry, scythed chariots with blades sharp enough to cut men in half, elephants brought from India, archers, spearmen, nobles from every corner of the empire. Darius stood once more at the head of a storm, and Alexander, upon hearing of it, smiled that same dangerous smile. The hunter had found his prey again, but this time the field would not favor him. This time the battle would not be by accident. As the armies began their long approach toward the plain of Gaugamela, a strange stillness settled over the world, as if the earth itself held its breath. Because what was coming was not just another clash of kings. It was the rematch of destiny itself, and one of them would not walk away. The plains of Gaugamela. What if the gods gave you everything: power, fame, the loyalty of thousands only, to test what you'd do when the whole world stood against you again? And what if that test came from the same man you'd already defeated once? The sun rose pale and trembling over the dusty plain of Gaugamela. The horizon shimmered like a blade fresh from the forge, and both Kings Alexander and Darius were already awake long before dawn. They knew this battle was not just about armies or crowns. It was about who would own the memory of the world. The night before, Alexander stood outside his tent beneath a quiet sky, tracing constellations like battle lines. His generals argued over strategy, inside Parmenion urging caution, Philotas craving the glory of a full assault. Alexander listened to none of it. When Parmenion finally asked what he feared most, Alexander looked up at the stars and said, "Only that Darius might escape me again." Across the field, Darius sat in his chariot, ringed by his immortals, staring into the empty dark as his servants adjusted the jeweled reins of his horses. He had done everything right this time. The plain had been leveled by his engineers to give his scythed chariots perfect ground. His army was vast, some said, 1,000,000 men. Columns of cavalry gleamed like rivers of fire. Behind him, elephants from the eastern provinces swayed and stamped, their riders whispering prayers to forgotten gods. This was the empire's last stand, and he would not run again. Not this time. By morning, dust rose from the Persian lines like a storm cloud. Trumpets screamed. Alexander mounted Bucephalus armor, polished to mirror the dawn. His men, hardened by years of conquest, waited in silence, each heartbeat loud as thunder. The young king raised his hand, and in that gesture alone, the world seemed to pause. "Remember," he called, "we fight not for gold or land, but for what they said we could never have the right to rule destiny." The phalanx struck their sorrows against shields, a forest of iron trembling. The air crackled with belief. Darius's chariots moved first, 200 of them, each a storm of blades. They cut across the plain in waves, scythes glittering, horses screaming. The Persians roared, a sound vast enough to shake the air. Alexander watched, perfectly still, then gave a single nod. His men opened ranks. The chariots plunged into empty space. Arrows rained. Pikes skewered horses mid. Others were trapped in ditches dug overnight by Macedonian engineers. Within minutes, what was meant to be the weapon of gods became a graveyard of shattered wheels and dying horses. But the real danger came next. Darius unleashed his cavalry, tens of thousands, sweeping around the Macedonian flanks like a tide. Dust engulfed the horizon. The Persian center began to advance. For the first time, Alexander's line bent backward under sheer pressure. Parmenian's left wing, anchored by weary troops, faltered under the onslaught. A messenger rode through the chaos, shouting for Alexander's help. Alexander glanced once toward the left and did not move. He saw what others couldn't. The heart of the Persian army lay open, stretched too far, too fast. The temptation was irresistible. He turned to his companions and shouted, "Now!" With that word, history pivoted. The companion cavalry wheeled right, forming a wedge-living sp. The world held its breath as they charged straight for the Persian center. The sound was like a thunderstorm colliding with earth. Alexander led from the front, his helmet flashing, spear lowered, Bucephalus thundering beneath him. Arrows streaked the sky. Chariots veered aside. The wedge cut through ranks of Persian infantry, slicing toward the golden chariot that glimmered in the distance. Darius watched the approaching dust and fire, his mouth dry, his mind a blur of disbelief. He had done everything right. He had numbers, preparation, prophecy. Yet here, in this moment, he saw the same thing he had seen at Issus, the unstoppable will of one man defying reason itself. His guard closed in around him, but the line was breaking. The Macedonian charge had split his army like a crack through marble. Alexander's spear struck home. His men poured into the gap. In the chaos, the great king's horses reared, struck by panic or omen, and the chariot lurched sideways. Darius was almost thrown. A cry rose from his own ranks. "The king has fallen." It wasn't true, but the rumors spread faster than the truth ever could. Panic is the true weapon of war. Within minutes, order disintegrated. Chariots collided, cavalry fled, banners toppled. The Persian army, so vast, so carefully arranged, became a flood of fear. Darius tried to stay, shouting commands lost in the roar, but when his charioteer begged him to flee, instinct took command. Once again, the great king turned and ran. Alexander saw it. Even through the haze of battle, he saw the flash of the royal chariot retreating. He urged Bucephalus forward, determined to end what had begun years ago. But then came a voice, Parmenian's messenger, breathless, desperate. The left wing is collapsing. We're surrounded. The king reined in. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. Chase Darius now, and the empire falls in a single stroke. Turn back, and his army survives the day, but the king escapes again. He chose his men. He wheeled his horse and thundered toward the left flank, driving his companions into the Persian cavalry like a hammer shattering glass. The lines stabilized. The danger passed. But by the time he turned again toward the east, Darius was gone, swallowed by the dust of his own defeat. When the sun finally sank, the plain of Gaugamela was silent except for the wind whispering over the dead. The Persian Empire, the greatest in history, had shattered. Alexander dismounted slowly, his armor dented, his face streaked with dirt and blood. His men knelt, not out of ritual, but out of awe. He had done the impossible again. He had defeated the world twice. That night, under a vault of unfamiliar stars, he stood alone, staring east where the darkness thickened over Babylon. He will run, he said softly, and I will follow. His generals urged rest, celebration, feasting, but he could not stop. The fire inside him no longer burned for victory, burned for pursuit, for the closure that never came. Darius had escaped again, and as long as he lived, Alexander's triumph was incomplete. He entered Babylon to thunderous welcome gates opened. Gold poured at his feet. Priests hailed him as ruler. He walked through the hanging gardens and the marbled halls of kings long dead, yet his gaze never lingered. To others, this was paradise. To him, it was only a milestone, because somewhere beyond those walls, beyond the Euphrates and the deserts, the man who had once ruled the world was still breathing. And until that breath stopped, Alexander knew the war was not over. He turned his eyes east once more, and in that silence, under the alien stars, one could almost hear destiny laughing because it was not done with either of them yet. The last king of Persia, what if you had already lost everything, but pride refused to let you stop fighting? And what if the man chasing you wasn't just after your throne, but after the very idea of you? The night after Gaugamela, the great king did not sleep. Darius III sat by a dwindling fire in the dark hills east of Arbela, staring at the crown in his lap. The gold gleamed dully, catching the trembling light like something already fading. Around him, the remnants of his army, once 1,000,000 strong, huddled in silence. The desert wind moved through their camp like a whisper of ghosts. They were still Persians, still soldiers, but the rhythm of empire had been broken. The man they had followed for years was now a fugitive among his own people. He should have died at Gaugamela. Many said so. But Darius's instinct for survival was as strong as Alexander's for victory. He sent word across the eastern satrapies, commanding new levies from Bactria, from Sogdia, from the edge of the world where mountains touched the clouds. The empire's east was vast, and loyalty there still lingered. Yet for the first time, Darius wasn't raising an army to conquer. He was raising one to survive. Alexander, meanwhile, marched in a blaze of inevitability. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis all fell one after another, their gates opening as if to destiny itself. Each city surrendered its wealth, its secrets, its soul. The Macedonian phalanx walked roads that had never known invaders, their spears flashing under the Persian sun. But as the gold piled higher and the victories grew easier, something strange began to happen to the young king. Triumph started to taste like dust. At Persepolis, the beating heart of the Persian world, Alexander stood at the foot of the great palace of Xerxes. The walls still shimmered with carvings of tribute bearers and kings kneeling before the throne. He climbed the steps slowly, each one echoing through centuries. When he reached the top, the wind carried the scent of burning cedar and crushed stone. He looked out over the city that had ruled countenance, said quietly, "This is not conquest. This is justice." That night, after feasting and wine, the torch that would ignite the palace was lit. Some say it was his idea. Others that it was a drunken dare whispered by the courtesan ties. But once the flame touched the timber, the fire leaped like something alive. Columns cracked, roofs roared, and the night turned red. The palace of kings became a pyre of empires. Alexander watched the flames climb the sky and flicker across his face, and for a moment he didn't look like a victor. He looked like a man trying to erase a memory. When dawn came, Persepolis was a skeleton of smoke and ruin. The soldiers celebrated, but Alexander's eyes were distant. Burning a city was easy. What haunted him was the man who had built it. Darius still lived somewhere beyond the Zagros mountains, gathering what remained of his fractured dominion. "Until he kneels," Alexander said, "Asia is not mine." So he marched again, leaving behind the marble halls for mountain passes, where even the wind cut like glass. Weeks turned into months. The army shrank under exhaustion, hunger, and frost. Yet Alexander never slowed. Scouts brought back tales. Darius was fleeing north, deeper into the wilderness, escorted by a handful of loyal satraps. One of them, Besses, the governor of Bactria, was said to have sworn new allegiance, promising to protect his king. But promises made in fear often rot before they reach their end. In a narrow valley near Ecbatana, Darius's luck finally snapped. His bodyguard had dwindled to a few hundred. Bessus and the other satraps began whispering, their loyalty fraying under the weight of pursuit. They told Darius they would ride ahead to gather reinforcements. He believed them. By nightfall, they returned not as protectors, but as captors. They bound the great king's hands with his own royal cords and dragged him in his own chariot like a prisoner. They meant to hand him over to Alexander as a peace offering to save themselves by betraying their master. But fate has a cruel sense of drama. Alexander's vanguard, riding through the dust, was closer than anyone thought. Word of the betrayal reached them at dawn. The king spurred Bucephalus into a gallop, his companions thundering behind, driven by something far beyond revenge. By the time they reached the Persian camp, the scene was chaos soldiers scattering, fires half-burnt, wagons overturned. The traitors had fled, and in the center of the road, in a broken chariot, lay Darius III. He was still alive. The great king's robes were torn, his face bloodied, his body pierced by the spears of those who had once sworn to die for him. When Alexander dismounted and approached, the dying monarch lifted his head with effort. Their eyes met for the first and only time, not as conqueror and enemy, but as two men who had chased the same impossible dream. Through cracked lips, Darius spoke words that history barely remembers. "Tell him." "I gave him all I could not keep." His voice faltered, but there was no hatred in its tonely exhaustion, only peace. Alexander knelt beside him, removed his own cloak, and covered the fallen king. Darius's eyes closed, as if finally surrendering not to his enemy, but to the weight of destiny. For a long while, Alexander said nothing. Then he whispered, "You were the last to stand against me. Rest, for now you have no equal." He ordered the body carried with honor, wrapped in royal linens, and sent to Persepolis for burial with the rites of Persian kings. His soldiers watched in silence, some uneasy, others awed. Their commander was not just a conqueror anymore. He was something else, something larger, something the old world did not yet have a name for. That night, alone in his tent, Alexander didn't celebrate. He stared at the maps, before him the vast, unending lands of the East. The man who had once been his greatest opponent was gone, and yet victory felt like a wound that refused to close. Without Darius, there was no mirror left in which to measure himself. Outside, the campfires flickered across the plain, stretching farther than the eye could see. The Macedonians toasted their king, sang songs of triumph, and dreamed of home. But Alexander's eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the sky faded into the mountains of Bactria and beyond. He knew what lay ahead: deserts, revolts, endless campaigns, and he also knew he would march toward them all, because the boy who once sought to outsmart a king had now conquered the world. And yet, as the night deepened, he felt a strange truth coil inside him. He had won everything except the peace he thought victory would bring. The empire was his, but Alexander had already begun to lose himself. The shadow beyond victory, what happens when the man who conquered the world realizes there's nowhere left to go? And what if the greatest enemy left to face is the one that follows him everywhere, his own reflection? The mountains of Persia faded behind him like ghosts. Alexander no longer marched for territory. He marched because stopping felt like dying. The death of Darius had closed one story, but opened another darker one without boundaries. In the months that followed, the Macedonian army trudged east through lands whose names even their guides could not pronounce. They crossed deserts that swallowed whole caravans, climbed ridges where the wind screamed like a living thing. The men began to wonder whether they were still conquering or simply chasing the horizon. But Alexander could not turn back. Something in him had shifted. He had buried the last king of Persia with royal honors, but he had inherited the Persians' obsession, the belief that a ruler could bind the world together under a single will. He began dressing in Persian robes, surrounding himself with Eastern courtiers, and adopting titles once spoken only for Darius. To the Macedonians who had followed him from Pella, it felt like watching a god become a stranger. Whispers spread in the ranks. The men had once called him Alexander the Great in awe. Now some muttered it with unease. They had crossed oceans and deserts for him, killed and bled in his name. But when he began demanding proskynesis bowing, as if before a deity many refused, to them Alexander was their king, not their god. Yet every protest met the same answer, a cold stare that reminded them this man no longer saw the world as they did. Still, none could deny his genius. The campaign against Bactria and Sogdia became a grim masterpiece of endurance and strategy. Villages hidden in the mountains were rooted out, rebels broken, cities rebuilt. But even Alexander's victories began to taste bitter. The farther he went, the more resistance grew, not from armies, but from the land itself. The rivers turned to dust, the nights froze to silence. Men deserted, horses died, supply lines vanished into sandstorms. Each morning, fewer soldiers stood at attention, and still he pressed on. In one of those cold valleys, a new shadow entered his Lafraxena. She was the daughter of a local nobleman, fierce-eyed and proud. Some said he married her for love, others for politics. Perhaps it was both. At their wedding, beneath torchlight and the hum of foreign music. His men watched as the boy who once sought glory became a man chasing immortality through legacy. For the first time, Alexander smiled without conquest in his eyes. Yet even that softness could not last. Word came from the westry vaults, whispers of dissent, men weary of endless war. Back in Susa, his generals quarreled. In India, new kingdoms waited. And so he turned east again, toward the unknown, toward the lands where maps faded into speculation. The journey into India was unlike anything before. The monsoon rains turned the ground to rivers. The forests seemed alive, their trees towering like gods of green. At the Hydaspes River, he faced King Parasa ruler who, like Darius before him, refused to kneel. Porus's army brought elephants, towering beasts armored in bronze, their tusks capped with blades. The river between them surged high with rain, impossible to cross. Alexander studied it for days, then crossed it at night in a storm so violent it erased sound. His men followed without question. They had stopped questioning long ago. The battle that followed was chaos turned to art. Elephants charged, men screamed, pikes shattered, and the air stank of mud and blood. At one point, Porus himself, massive and defiant, rode his elephant into the center of the Macedonian line, his spear cutting through the storm. Alexander, drenched and half-blinded, rode straight for him. When they finally met, man to man, both bleeding, both exhausted, something in the world seemed to pause again, just as it had at Issus, just as it had at Gaugamela. When Porus fell, Alexander approached and asked, "How would you wish to be treated?" The defeated king, towering even in chains, replied, "As a king." And Alexander, with that same glint of respect he had shown to Darius, said, "So shall it be." He returned Porus his lands and title. In that gesture, he gained something greater than territory, the loyalty of India's heart. But the victory broke something in his army. The men had reached their limit. They had fought for years, crossed continents, buried friends in every desert and mountain range. Now they stood at the banks of the Hyphasis River, looking east toward lands that seemed endless. When Alexander ordered the march to continue, silence greeted him. Then, one by one, the veterans laid down their spears. He tried to reason, to inspire, even to shame them. He spoke of the glory ahead, of worlds yet unconquered. But the faces staring back were no longer filled with awe. They were filled with exhaustion. Finally, realizing no speech could move them, he turned away. For the first time in his life, Alexander the Great retreated. They marched back through deserts that devoured men like memories. The Gedrosian desert claimed thousands. Hunger, thirst, and heat became enemies that could not be outwitted. When at last they reached Babylon, the city greeted them like a mirage come true. The empire stretched farther than any before, yet its master seemed smaller, thinner, quieter. In the great halls of Babylon, Alexander began to plan again new ships, new expeditions, a march toward Arabia. His dream was endless. But fate, it seemed, had grown weary of his ambition. One evening, during a feast in the palace, he fell ill. Some said fever, others whispered poison. For days he burned with heat, his voice fading to a whisper. His generals crowded around his bed, waiting for orders, for a sign, for the impossible assurance that he would rise again. When they asked who should inherit his empire, he managed only 3 words, to the strongest. Those words fell like prophecy. Within weeks, Alexander, conqueror of worlds, master of armies, and dreamer of destiny, was gone 32 years old, undefeated in battle, yet conquered by mortality itself. When they carried his body through the streets of Babylon, even the air seemed to mourn. His men wept not just for their king, but for the part of themselves that had believed in forever. The empire he built cracked before his ashes cooled, torn apart by those who had loved him most. And yet, even in ruin, his name endured. It crossed centuries like an echo that refused to fade. The cities he built still whispered of his vision. The stories of his battles still taught courage and cunning. The world remembered the boy who stepped onto Asian soil and never stepped back. Perhaps that's what greatness truly is, not perfection, not peace, but the refusal to be forgotten. Because even now, when the wind sighs across the ruins of Issus, or through the broken gates of Gaugamela, it carries a whisper still heard in every age. There was once a man who dared to outsmart the impossible,